Welcome back. In this lecture, we continue our study of Galatians chapter 1. This is lecture 5, and we're considering the theme of the slave of the Messiah. Now, unlike our previous lecture, rather than just drill down into a couple of verses and study the intricacies of Greek syntax and lexicography, we're going to sort of broaden out and try to cover a swath of verses 10 through 24, and get a sense for where Paul is going and what he's trying to accomplish in this first part of the letter. You might remember when I talked about the structure of the letter, we talked about it in two ways. One was kind of a very basic, simple epistolary structure: opening, body, closing. And then I kind of did a slightly more specific, detailed outline where I took the first 9 verses as establishing who Paul was and what the problem was that he was addressing, namely that the Galatian Gentile believers were at risk. Perhaps some had already deserted the gospel Paul preached. And in the last lesson, we noted that for Paul, the singularity of the gospel did not preclude two versions of it, a version for the circumcised and a version for the uncircumcised. So there was a unity of the gospel in two applications based on this ethnic differentiation. But what apparently was going on is a group of agitators, as he characterizes them, influencers, had attempted to force these Gentile Galatian believers in not only putting faith in Messiah, but also the obligation to then structure their lives according to the norms of the Torah. So they had to be Torah observant. They had to frame their life like Jews do, with obviously the initial step to be circumcised. Now, this is all in the opening, and we come to an important transition at verse 10 with this paragraph of 5 propositions that move progressively to a crescendo. And the crescendo is this claim that Paul makes that he's a slave of Messiah. He's Messiah's slave. And that brings the opening to a close, and it is a transition into the body of the letter. So in terms of the importance of verse 10 in the letter, it has a sort of a fundamental significance, because it transitions us into the body of the letter from 1:11, which then the body will take us all the way to the end of the letter in 6:10 before we have the conclusion. So this is a pivotal paragraph. Secondly, if you study this paragraph, as we will briefly before we move into the rest of chapter 1's content, and you compare it to chapter 6 and the conclusion, you see significant parallels between these two sections, and it suggests that there is an intentional inclusio, or bookending, whereby Paul asserts or discusses two similar things that sort of put the book together and give us some interpretive frame for the whole. So the similarities between this verse and the end suggest an additional piece of evidence that this is an important passage. Then thirdly, I would say that this passage, verse 10 of chapter 1, is significant because it implicitly, I think, reveals the circumstances behind the problem in Galatia. So what we discover is something of what Paul imagines to be the issue. This will be further clarified throughout the letter more directly, and then at the end he sort of pulls the gloves off and just goes knuckle to chin, you might say, in his accusations, not against the Gentile believers in Jesus, but these influencers, these agitators. So this is a very important passage, and it sets up then as a transition from the opening to the body. And the first section of the body of the letter is what is often called the autobiography, from 111 to 221. And so we're going to be kind of coming into that autobiography, into the middle of it. And so we need to talk a little bit about that autobiography as well, and its sort of purpose and function. Now, if we look at the logic of this passage very briefly, we'll see that it's made up of these 5 propositions, the first 3 of which are rhetorical questions. Now, you know probably a rhetorical question is not actually a question. It's a statement in the form of a question, which makes that then a bit more gripping, a bit more biting. And so he's asserting, I am not trying to win the approval of human beings. It's not like, what do you think? I'm not, right? I'm not trying to do that. I am trying to win the approval of God, period. And then almost then a repetition here. Am I trying to please people? I'm not trying to please people. So 10c is really a restatement, a repetition of 10a. And again, a repetition in 10d, now in the form of a conditional clause. A conditional clause has 2 parts. The first proposition serves the second proposition, and you'll notice that in this first proposition of the conditional clause, 10d and 10e, if I were still trying to please people, I would not be a slave of Messiah. I would not be Messiah's slave. Notice that 10d really is a summation of the previous 3 propositions, a restatement. Nothing has really moved forward in the argument from 10a to 10c and 10d, where the argument then develops, and really the direction of all of this argument is then at 10e, where sort of climactically Paul then asserts, I would not be a Messiah, I would not be a slave of Messiah if I were still trying to please people. So if we sort of invert the logic and start with the main point, Paul would be asserting, I'm Messiah's slave, and that's incontestable, you might say. It's like anyone looks at his life. In fact, at the end of the letter, he says, and I have the marks of the Messiah. I have the stigmata. I have the wounds to prove my enslavement to the Messiah. That aspect of his apostolic identity could not be contested. And so on that, he then says, I don't seek to please people. I don't seek to please another master besides him. And so I try only to win the approval of God and not any other person. And so the importance of then this statement that Paul is Messiah's slave serves to address implicitly an idea that there are other potential masters, and I would suggest that this is meant to be something of an attack, subtle, but nevertheless an attack on the agitators. Now, the way traditionally people understand this statement is not so much that Paul is on the attack, but rather that he's on the defensive. So you might wonder, why now does Paul address this sort of issue of man-pleasing, of pleasing humans, and some most suggest that this is because the influencers, these agitators, have attempted to unsettle or destabilize Paul's authority in these churches, and they've done that by making accusations against Paul, saying something like the only reason Paul is preaching this circumcision-free gospel is because he's seeking approval from human beings, and that kind of line of logic, and so interpreters sort of assume that, and then they then in addition have to then understand this to be something of a defensive, claiming, no, I don't do that, because if that were the case, I would not be Messiah's slave. Now that sounds all well and good, but it is potentially dangerous mirror reading gone wild. Mirror reading is a term that was coined by scholars to describe the phenomenon of having sort of one side of a phone conversation and trying to then reconstruct the other side of the phone conversation. So you have a statement of Paul, and then you try to mirror read it to kind of get at what Paul was addressing. And so if you mirror read this verse, then you come out with a reconstruction that Paul is on the defensive. There are accusations against him that his gospel and his gospel ministry come from human agency. You know, that was potentially suggested in that opening verse of the book, where Paul says, "My gospel or my apostleship did not come from men, nor was it by a man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father." He's going to then pick this strand up again in verses 11 and following, when he talks about having received an apocalypse of Jesus, the Messiah, not having been taught, not receiving the tradition and normal conventional ways that tradition is passed on. There was an intervention. There was a sort of a break. God revealed outside of normal processes for teaching, and so these pieces tend to be put together and then mirror read to suggest that Paul's on the defensive, trying to reclaim his authority that he's lost based on the attacks of the teachers. Now, again, there may be something to that, but I want to suggest that perhaps better than on the defensive, we should read these passages as Paul on the offensive. He's hacked, he's ticked, he's frustrated, he's impassioned. And if we just kind of read these off, kind of plain off the text, and not sort of speculate a reconstructed attack, then what you end up having here is not so much Paul addressing specific arguments that have been put forward against him, but in a sense, he is trying to delegitimize the agitators by establishing his own apostolic authority, which he does in several points throughout the letter. And so what I'm suggesting here is, rather than Paul being on his back foot defending himself, he's actually out front, seeking to delegitimize the agitators by, you might say, pulling the veil. Since we're using apocalyptic words, pulling the veil and exposing, from his perspective, of course, the motives of these agitators. And here he does it subtly. So he doesn't seek to please people, but the point is that they do. So their attempt to pervert the gospel does not come from the truth of the gospel. It doesn't come from Jesus himself. It comes from their concern to honor, to obey, to submit to an authority other than Jesus, other than the Messiah. And Paul says unequivocally that is not true of him. So, in this sense, this verse and the propositions crescendoing in its logic to this sort of claim that Paul is the slave of Messiah has both a backward-looking and a forward-looking aspect. It backwardly exposes the motives of the troublemakers that Paul will reference on a number of occasions, but it also has a forward-looking aspect to it, whereby Paul is reestablishing or establishing his authority by an implicit comparison all the way through particularly the autobiography. Paul is going to tell several stories, 3 different stories where he establishes himself as a significant authority, and these stories, I think, serve the purpose of trying to convince his audience, his hearers, that he has the authority over and against these pseudo-authoritative influencers. So the passage is a transitional sort of pivot hinge between what he just said in verses 6 through 9 and what he's about to say in 11 through really the rest of chapter 1 and chapter 2. And the claim of being Messiah's slave becomes a thesis statement of this whole letter, that being the Messiah's slave means one's allegiance, one's norming principle, whether you're a circumcised Jew or an uncircumcised Gentile. Your normative principle of life must be allegiance to the Messiah. Now, I want to give you a hint here that this is not simply a general statement against people-pleasing. I think obviously this can be applied to sort of a general tendency among human beings to seek to please people. But I believe if you look at this through the whole of the letter, this statement about man-pleasing, about people-pleasing, is not really a general prohibition against seeking approval of human beings, but rather when you look at statements like he'll make about his former life in Judaism, say in 1:13 through 14, how before he had the Christophany on the road to Damascus, he was zealously pursuing the traditions of the fathers, but when God was pleased to reveal his Son in Paul, he began a ministry to the Gentiles, to proclaim to the Gentiles the Messiah. And so there you can see that Paul has undergone something of a transformation of authority, shifting from a pursuit of what he calls the traditions of the fathers, which I take to be really a reference to Pharisaic authority, and so he changes from being a Pharisaic Jew to what you might call a Messianic Jew, and so his allegiance, the authority which determines how he understands Torah is not the Pharisaic tradition anymore, but it's the life, death, resurrection, self-giving of the Messiah. That's the norming principle. That's the framework that one then interprets Torah for life as a Jew, and so 1:13-14 suggests this people-pleasing idea is narrower, is more focused than sort of general people pleasing. Now, I would also just give you the hint of chapter 5, verse 11, where Paul says something that's kind of hard to interpret, but there in 5:11 he says, "If I'm still preaching circumcision, why am I being persecuted?" And so that word "still," which is also in our passage, if I were still trying to please people, and there he says, if I was still preaching circumcision, I suggest, and we'll look at this perhaps a little bit in more detail later, I suggest that is a reference to sort of his former life in Judaism, that he no longer follows because of his allegiance to Messiah, because he's a slave of Messiah. Just giving you this hint that verse 10 is not simply a general prohibition against seeking approval from human beings, although that's certainly an appropriate application or extension of the meaning. But Paul, I think, here has much more direct sort of understanding of this to be related to this idea that Jesus, the Messiah, must be the orienting, norming, defining principle for what it means to live in the world as both a circumcised and uncircumcised member of the body of Messiah. So as we now shift and think through the rest of the chapter, and I want to do this just sort of much more rapidly. Then, with that framing, with that sort of introduction, then Paul will establish through several stories his authority and this implicit comparison against the so-called agitators, in order to delegitimize them and to establish his authority to exercise influence over the Gentiles. And he begins with a statement that's quite remarkable and worth considering, where in verse 11 he says, "I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preach is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus, the Messiah." So for Paul, the logic of his apostolic mission and work comes not from the normal processes of receiving teaching, but has been given in direct, in a direct and immediate way from God Himself. Now, as we think about this structure of the autobiography, I want you to see the logical framework of the section. It's quite beautiful in a way. It's well structured. You have the claim in verse 10 that Paul's Messiah's slave, and then you have a support for that, a supporting premise for that. That his gospel comes from the divine sphere. The origin of his gospel is divine. And so he makes this claim, and then immediately he supports that claim with a premise that he doesn't seek the approval of human beings. He's a Messiah's slave, because his gospel has divine origin. And then he provides three evidences that support the premise that supports the claim. Does that make sense? You can see it there on the slide. And the three evidences are the three stories from the so-called autobiography. He tells a story of turning from being a persecutor of the ecclesia to being a proclaimer of the ecclesia. And so that takes us through the first chapter. And then we have 2 episodes in chapter 2 that we'll look at next week, where Paul describes a conference he has with the pillar apostles, and then this significant story about Paul's confrontation of Peter. But each of these 3 evidences, their function is to support the claim that Paul's gospel is of divine origin. And all of that, so verse 11 of chapter 1 through the end of chapter 2, supports the main claim of verse